Welcome to Life Stories, where real-life journeys of resilience, love, and transformation unfold. Today, we dive into the gripping story of Lauren, a young woman who faces the painful unraveling of her family, the betrayal of those she trusted, and the ultimate battle to reclaim her inheritance. Through heartache and growth, Lauren learns profound lessons about forgiveness, strength, and self-discovery. This is a story of overcoming, of rebuilding from the ground up, and of finding hope in the face of adversity. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin this journey with us today. My life changed forever when I was 15. Up until that point, everything seemed stable, predictable, almost too perfect in its normalcy. But then, like a storm that comes out of nowhere, my world was torn apart, leaving me caught in the wreckage of my parents' broken marriage. It was a Friday evening when my father, Mark, came home from work, his face pale, eyes dull with a sadness I had never seen before. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, and my mother, Susan, was in the kitchen, humming along to a song on the radio. There was a certain ease in the house that night, a sort of calm that felt out of place in hindsight. Mark had always been the calm, steady figure in our family, the one who kept things running smoothly. He worked tirelessly at his job as the manager of the family business, a company my grandmother, Eleanor, had built from the ground up. He'd inherited the role when she grew too ill to manage the company herself. And for as long as I could remember, he had been the one to make all the decisions, lead meetings, and deal with clients. It wasn't just a job for him, it was a part of his identity. It meant everything to him. But that night, there was something different in the air. I remember my heart sinking when Mark called me into the living room, his voice heavy with an emotion I couldn't place. "Lauren, there's something we need to talk about," he said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know why, but something in his voice told me this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. I don't know how to say this, but your mother and I have decided to separate." I froze. The words barely registered in my brain. Separate? What did that even mean? My parents had always had their little spats, disagreements over this or that, but separation? Divorce? That wasn't something I had ever imagined in my wildest dreams. My mother appeared in the doorway, looking completely unbothered. She crossed her arms, glancing at Mark before turning her attention to me. "We've been having some issues for a while now," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the usual warmth that I had grown up with. "It's not something I wanted to do, but it's what's best for everyone." Best for everyone? My heart began to pound in my chest. How could this possibly be for the best? My world, the foundation of everything I thought I knew, was suddenly cracking. But what hurt the most was how little it seemed to affect my mother. It wasn't like she was devastated, or even upset. She seemed almost relieved. And then, just like that, my father was gone. He moved out of our house, leaving behind a vacuum of silence that filled every corner of the rooms. His absence was so palpable, so jarring, that I couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of loss. My mother, on the other hand, didn't seem to miss him at all. In fact, within weeks, she remarried. His name was Tom, and from the moment I met him, I felt uneasy. He wasn't bad, he was charming, polite even, but there was something about him that didn't sit right with me. I couldn't place it at first, but every time I looked at him, I felt a tightness in my chest, a kind of warning. Tom wasn't just a stepfather. He was a presence that began to dominate our household in a way I couldn't ignore. He had a way of taking up space, of controlling the room without saying much, of making decisions that didn't involve me. I couldn't understand why my mother, who had always been so independent, would marry someone like him. The business that my father had once led, the business my grandmother had built and handed down to him, changed hands as well. I wasn't given much of a choice in the matter. But the company was no longer under my father's control. Instead, it was passed to me. My grandmother, before she passed away, had told me that she believed I could do a better job running the company than my mother. She trusted me more, and in her final moments, she made sure that the family business was placed in my hands. But even that didn't offer me the sense of security I had hoped for. I didn't feel like the owner of anything. I felt like a stranger in my own life. An outsider in my own family. I was left to navigate the growing tension with my mother and Tom, who had taken control of everything in my absence, including the company. My mother, though, wasn't interested in giving up the access she had to the wealth and resources that came with owning the company. I felt so alone, trapped between the demands of my inheritance and the resentment I was beginning to feel toward the people I was supposed to trust most. The very people who were supposed to protect me had left me in a position where I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. And as much as I hated to admit it, I started to doubt everything: myself, my family, and the values I had grown up with. The foundation of love and security that I once thought was unshakable had crumbled. And I had no idea how to rebuild it. In that moment, I realized that life, no matter how well planned or secure we think it is, can fall apart in the blink of an eye. It's a lesson that would haunt me for the years to come. But what was even more painful was realizing how easily I had become just another casualty in the war between the people I loved most. My parents' love for me, for each other, had been so fragile that it shattered without warning. As I sat there in the emptiness of my house, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens now? Where do I go from here? That question, one I never expected to ask at 15, would follow me for a long time. But I had no choice but to move forward, even though I had no idea how. As I entered my 20th year, life seemed to take on a new weight. The separation between my parents was no longer just a distant memory, but a permanent fixture in the landscape of my heart. It had been 5 years since Mark left, and even though time had passed, the sting of that loss was still fresh, lingering in the corners of my life. But that year, something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything once again. It came in the form of an old, familiar letter. My grandmother, Eleanor, who had been a pillar of strength in my life, had passed away when I was 17. But before she died, she made a decision that still echoes in my life today. She left me the family business, the company my father had once managed with such passion. The company that had been passed down through generations. It wasn't just a financial asset. It was a legacy. A symbol of everything my family had built. And she had trusted me with it. I didn't feel ready for this responsibility. I was still navigating the emotional fallout from the broken family I had been left with. Struggling to understand who I was without the constant presence of my parents' marriage as a backdrop. And yet, in her final days, Eleanor had written a letter explaining her reasoning. She believed in me. She thought I had what it took to carry the torch, to make the company thrive again, in ways she feared it couldn't under my mother's influence. My mother, Susan, had always been charming, always knew how to make people like her. But Eleanor saw what I hadn't. She saw my mother's inability to lead. Her self-serving behavior that often masked itself as kindness. In truth, I had never seen myself as the person to take on such a monumental task. I had always been content to stay in the background, studying, figuring out who I was, away from the chaos that defined my home. I didn't want to be involved in the corporate world. I had dreams of travel, of art, of freedom from the expectations that seemed to follow me everywhere. But now, the weight of my grandmother's decision rested on my shoulders, and I had to carry it. When I first sat down with the letter and read her words, I felt a surge of pride mixed with a gnawing sense of fear. The business was mine now, and I had to manage it. But with that inheritance came conflict. A conflict I hadn't anticipated. My mother and Tom, her new husband, had already made plans to take control of the company. It was as if they couldn't let go of their need for power and influence over me and the resources that came with my inheritance. I could feel their eyes on the company from the moment I made it clear that I would not simply hand over the reins. They had already begun to take steps to access the company's accounts. And their intentions seemed anything but honest. I didn't know whom I could trust anymore. The people who were supposed to be my support system were now my adversaries. And my mother, once a constant source of comfort, was now an obstacle whose emotional detachment and need for control made it nearly impossible to see eye to eye. The first few months of my newfound role were filled with awkward meetings, tense phone calls, and difficult decisions. I had to meet with lawyers, accountants, and business executives, people who spoke in a language I didn't fully understand. Who expected me to know how to navigate this world? Despite the fact that I was just a young woman learning on the fly. What struck me most during this time was how little my mother seemed to care about my own struggles. I had assumed that when I inherited the business, she would want to help guide me through the transition, offer her wisdom, or at least some emotional support. But instead, she seemed determined to push me aside, eager to take over what she could. As if the years of tension between us hadn't mattered. At times, I felt utterly alone in this battle. I wasn't ready to take on this responsibility. I wasn't prepared to fight my own mother for control of something that had been handed to me by my grandmother. But I realized something deep inside me. I had to fight. I had to stand up for the legacy that had been entrusted to me. Even if it meant going against the people I had always loved. One of the most difficult moments came when I had to confront my mother directly. We met at her house one afternoon, and I could feel the tension in the air before I even spoke. I knew she was angry with me, but I didn't expect the venom in her voice. "You don't know what you're doing, Lauren," she snapped, her face red with frustration. "This company is not something you can just play with. You think you're ready? You're not. You're too young. You don't have what it takes." Her words stung, but they didn't break me. Something inside me snapped, and for the first time, I stood my ground. "I'm doing this whether you like it or not," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "You had your chance, and you blew it. I'm not just going to hand over everything I've inherited to you. This is mine." Her eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she said nothing. The silence between us felt like an abyss. A place where words were useless. And in that silence, I realized something even more profound. No matter how much I might have wished for a normal family, for a supportive, loving mother, I was on my own now. I had to trust myself. The road ahead was unclear, filled with legal battles, accusations, and heartache. But in that moment, as I looked my mother in the eye, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for the company. I was fighting for my future. I was fighting to reclaim the strength I had almost lost in the chaos of my parents' failed marriage. By the time I turned 22, my life had become a whirlwind of business meetings, legal documents, and endless confrontation. The company that had once been a distant entity, something I'd only heard about in passing conversations with my grandmother, now occupied nearly every waking hour of my life. I thought I was prepared for the burden. But I quickly realized there were still many truths about my family and the business I'd inherited that I hadn't been ready to face. One of the hardest things I had to confront during this period was the realization that my mother, Susan, had been hiding something far darker than I had ever imagined. As I grew into the role of managing the company, I began to piece together the fragmented truths about the past. My grandmother's letters, old records in the office, and offhand comments from family friends revealed that my mother's marriage to Mark had been falling apart long before the divorce. And what hurt the most was what I discovered about her relationship with Tom, the man who, until then, I had seen as nothing more than an inconvenient new stepfather. The truth came crashing down one evening when I was going through some old documents at the company's headquarters. The more I dug, the more I saw discrepancies, unauthorized transfers, hidden accounts, and transactions that seemed completely out of place. It didn't take long to figure out that Tom wasn't just an innocent bystander in all of this. He was, in fact, deeply involved in undermining the very company I had inherited. The name, Tom Gray, kept appearing on suspicious transactions. And as I dug deeper, I realized that he had been siphoning money from the business for years. Worse, he wasn't just an opportunist, he had been manipulating my mother from the start. The revelation was nothing short of gut-wrenching. It felt like my entire world had been built on a foundation of lies. And everything I'd known about my family, about my mother, suddenly felt like it was slipping through my fingers. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to break down, feeling the weight of betrayal and anger. The very people who were supposed to protect me, who were supposed to guide me, had been the ones pulling the strings all along. I confronted my mother about what I'd found. I can still remember that moment with painful clarity. We were sitting in her living room, and the air between us was thick with unspoken accusations. The years of distance between us had only grown wider. and I could feel the tension rising in my chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you warn me? Why let me inherit a business that you and Tom have been stealing from?" For a moment, she said nothing. She just stared at me, her face a mask of shock and perhaps guilt, but mostly defensiveness. Then, slowly, she started speaking, her words cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "It wasn't meant to be like this," she murmured. "I never meant for it to get so far. Lauren, Tom, he made it all seem so easy. At first, he was my rock, my support after your father left. And then things just happened. I got lost, I guess." Her words didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. I wanted to scream, to throw everything I had in front of her and demand answers. But instead, I just sat there, numb. My heart was torn between anger and sorrow. How could she have allowed this to happen? How could she, the person who had raised me, the person I'd always relied on, have turned a blind eye to something so fundamentally wrong? But even in that moment, as I fought to hold back tears, something inside me clicked. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't rewrite the story of my childhood. Nor could I undo the choices my mother had made. What I could do was protect the legacy my grandmother had entrusted to me. I couldn't let my mother, or anyone else, destroy the business that had been the backbone of our family for generations. "I'm going to fix this," I told her, my voice steady now, even though my hands were trembling. "I'll take care of the company. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. But you and Tom are done. You're not going to ruin this for me. Or for my grandmother's memory." Her face fell, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. But it was too late for apologies. The truth had come out, and I was no longer that naive girl who would turn a blind eye to her mother's faults. What followed was a long and painful battle. Tom, who had been playing the role of a charming businessman, was exposed for what he truly was, a con artist. We took the matter to court, and with the help of lawyers and private investigators, we uncovered a trail of deceit that stretched back years. The legal battles were exhausting, the emotional toll staggering, but through it all, I learned something invaluable. I was capable of so much more than I had ever believed. The experience forced me to grow in ways I never imagined. I realized that even when people we love disappoint us, we must stand up for what is right. My relationship with my mother would never be the same, but I could still move forward. And in the end, it was the lessons learned from my grandmother, her unwavering strength and conviction, that kept me grounded. By the time the legal proceedings were over, and Tom was finally removed from the picture, I was a changed person. I had reclaimed the company. But more importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self. I had learned that true strength comes not from avoiding the pain, but from facing it head on and using it to drive us forward. As Lauren stood at the helm of the company her grandmother had built, she realized that the greatest lesson she'd learned wasn't about business or family inheritance. It was about resilience and self-discovery. The road had been long, filled with heartache and betrayal, but it had led her to a place of clarity. She had faced the darkest corners of her family's secrets and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they no longer defined her. The company was now in her hands. But more importantly, so was her future. The choices she made from this point forward would shape her legacy. Not just as a businesswoman, but as someone who had found the strength to stand alone, to choose integrity over convenience, and to heal the wounds of a broken past. And as she looked to the future, she knew she wasn't alone. There were people who believed in her. And through it all, she had learned to believe in herself. The journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. Thank you for following Lauren's journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life stories of resilience, courage, and personal transformation, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't miss out on the next chapter of life's most inspiring tales. Stay tuned for more and hit the bell icon to receive notifications of new videos.